Welcome to Brush Up.
Brush Up, your refresher on iconic historical events, fun facts, and much more. Stay tuned.
I'm Roberto.
I'm Judy.
I'm from Quito, Ecuador.
And I'm an American from France.
We are both history enthusiasts.
And today, we whipped up some of our favorite facts about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Here is your Brush Up.
Today's episode will cover three main parts. First, we'll discuss the history of Cuban politics.
Then, we will talk about the Cuban alliance with the Soviet Union and growing tension with the US.
And finally, we'll talk about the crisis itself as well as the aftermath.
Cuba was first colonized by Christopher Columbus and the Spanish in the late 15th century. For 3 centuries, until late 1700s, the island was largely neglected and it was used just as a stopping point for Spanish ships.
However, then it started becoming a major sugar producer in the world towards the early 19th century and therefore grew again in importance for Spain.
Despite the Latin American independence movement in the first half of the 19th century, Cuba stayed loyal to Spain.
However, tensions eventually grew because of various factors. For example, there was an increasing sense of nationalism within Cuba, increased rivalry between the Spanish and Creoles, and then also more taxation from Spain. So all of this led to the 10-year war between 1868 and 1878. However, it didn't result in independence.
Eventually, almost 2 decades later, the Second Independence War broke out and lasted about 3 years, between 1895 and 1898.
At the time, the U.S. had pretty strong ties with the independence movement in Cuba, and early in the conflict, the independence leader, José Martí, was killed. Therefore, tensions started growing between the U.S. and Spain.
As a result, U.S. investment in the island was hurt, and U.S. trade almost stopped. During the conflict, Cubans were held in reconcentration areas near the cities, and a riot eventually broke out in Havana in 1898.
This forced the U.S. to send ships for the safety of U.S. citizens in Cuba, and they officially entered the conflict during a period that's now referred to as the Spanish-American War. Shortly after their entry into the war, U.S. Congress recognized Cuba's independence from Spain and declared that the people of Cuba are, and of right ought to be, free and independent.
The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which granted Cuba's independence in December 1898. A fun fact is that this treaty also ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States and allowed the U.S. to purchase the Philippine Islands from Spain.
They bought it for only $20 million. What a deal. For some years after the independence, the U.S. still retained a lot of control of the island. They controlled a lot of the trading, and in 1901, they also put in place the Platt Amendment, which stipulated the right of the U.S. to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs, and also to lease land for a naval base.
Luckily, the island gained formal independence and became the Republic of Cuba in 1902, when the U.S. military stopped administering the island. However, the U.S. continued to intervene there on multiple occasions.
After Cuba's independence, there were many changes in leaderships for the next couple years. However, the rise in authoritarianism under President Machado in the 1930s led to student protests.
Sergeant Fulgencio Batista y Saldívar joined forces with the militant students and forced Machado to resign on August 12, 1933. Later on, the same Sergeant Batista got rid of another leader and eventually was elected president from 1940 to 1944.
After his presidency, Batista was dissatisfied with his successors, so he actually performed a coup d'etat on March 10, 1952, and led as a dictator until 1959. He was backed by the U.S. government because U.S. corporations and wealthy individuals owned almost half of Cuba's sugar plantations and a lot of other industries, and he imposed little restrictions on them.
On July 26, 1953, the Cuban Revolution broke out, led by Fidel Castro in an attempt to overthrow Batista's regime.
His anti-U.S. revolutionary movement came to be known as the 26th of July movement. A year later, in 1954, in response to growing opposition, Batista suspended constitutional protections for Cubans, including freedom of speech and assembly, and he also postponed the planned elections.
Many of you might know the name Ernesto Che Guevara. He was actually an Argentinian doctor who became part of Fidel Castro's effort to overthrow the Batista government in Cuba. He served as a military advisor to Castro and led troops against Batista's forces.
By 1958, the media was giving favorable coverage to the revolutionaries, so the U.S. slowly started to withdraw support for Batista's regime. By the end of the year, Castro's movement forced Batista to escape, and Fidel Castro officially seized power on January 1st, 1959.
Funny enough, the United States was one of the first countries to recognize Castro's government in Cuba.
Now let's talk about Cuba's growing alliance with the Soviet Union and what that meant for their relationship with the US.
After World War II, tensions arose throughout the world in what we refer to as the Cold War. The US and the USSR were pitted against each other as the US tried to fight the communism being spread by the Soviet Union.
Actually, in 1947, the US adopted the Truman Doctrine, which shifted American foreign policy to having an active containment strategy for the Soviet expansion. Tensions during the Cold War were especially high because both countries had access to nuclear weapons.
Quickly after taking power, Castro turned away from the US towards the USSR, and relationships between the US and Cuba deteriorated quickly. In May 1960, Castro established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and the United States responded by prohibiting the importation of Cuban sugar. Even more important, on January 3, 1961, the US broke diplomatic relations with Cuba entirely. About 3 months later, as a response, Castro began expropriating US properties and investments and converting Cuba into a one-party communist system.
He also started arresting US citizens and nationalized a lot of the American-dominated industries, like the sugar we just mentioned, mining, and other farming industries.
So in other words, Castro was fighting back the United States.
Actually, one of Castro's most popular slogans at the time was "Cuba sí, Yankees no."
The US was pretty disappointed with the current situation in Cuba, so they went so far as wanting the assassination or overthrow of Castro. In April 1961, the US launched the Bay of Pigs invasion.
So as a background, in early 1960, President Eisenhower had authorized the CIA to recruit and train over 1,000 Cuban exiles who were living in Miami to try and overthrow Castro. Then Kennedy, who became president in 1961, actually decided to launch this full-scale invasion of Cuba by these Cuban recruits.
On April 15, 1961, the Cuban exiles took off from Nicaragua in aircrafts painted to look like stolen Cuban planes. They conducted a strike against Cuban airfields, but Castro knew about it and had moved his planes already. 2 days later, others from the brigade invaded an isolated spot on the southern shore of Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs.
And that's where the Bay of Pigs invasion name comes from.
Unfortunately, the brigade ended up surrendering after less than 24 hours of fighting. Many problems arose that forced the brigade to surrender.
Yeah, they ran into a lot of problems. For example, there was unexpected coral reefs that sank some ships as they pulled into shore. There was also a problem with the backup paratroopers who landed in the wrong spot. And overall, they were just outnumbered by Castro, who actually expected this attack.
So it looks like the whole operation was poorly planned.
It was a complete failure. And actually, a radio station on the beach in Cuba broadcast every detail of the operation to listeners across the globe, so the US could not keep this failure a secret.
Both the media coverage as well as the failed invasion allowed Castro to emerge stronger and use his defeat of the Yankees as more propaganda. It's time for us to move to the crisis and the aftermath of the situation. At this point, JFK was in a tough political situation and appeared weak for a number of reasons. First, JFK didn't fully back up the exiles fighting during the Bay of Pigs. Secondly, the US didn't do anything while the Soviets built up the Berlin Wall that began in 1961 during the Berlin crisis.
So that same year, as a part of the larger Cold War conflict, the US placed missiles in Western Europe and Turkey very close to Soviet territory. But on their end, the Soviets also had a plan. Following the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro asked the USSR for help to deter further US aggression. Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, collaborated with Fidel Castro to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. This would also help the Soviets themselves, who could represent a bigger threat to the US and kind of retaliate for those missiles that were in Turkey.
So this is how, in the summer of 1962, Soviets start installing ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in Cuba. US intelligence discovered evidence of an arms buildup in Cuba during routine surveillance flights in September 1962.
So the Cuban Missile Crisis itself happened in 13 days. It was very short but very tense. On October 14th of 1962, so the same year a little bit later, an American pilot was making a pass over Cuba, and took pictures of a Soviet medium-range ballistic nuclear missile being assembled for installation. So this confirmed the fears that the American had about the Soviets being in Cuba.
8 days later, on October 22nd, Kennedy made a famous speech.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Following this public declaration, people tensely waited for the Soviet response. Some Americans, fearing their country was going to enter a nuclear war, hoarded food and gas.
This is around the same time that JFK announced the USA to be under DEFCON 2. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but this is the first time ever that this was called, and it means that it's the second highest level of state of alert for the US military, and it's only happened one other time in history since then. At the same time, Kennedy also called together an executive committee of the National Security Council, also called EXCOM, to help advise on the situation. He was presented with a couple of options. He could bomb the missile sites and conduct a full-scale invasion of Cuba, or he could conduct a naval blockade to stop the Soviets from sending more missiles to Cuba.
The final plan was to use a blockade and then deliver an ultimatum that the existing missiles be removed. Technically, a blockade is an act of war, so JFK called it a quarantine. The difference is that a quarantine didn't obstruct the supply of basic necessities. The USSR responded by saying, and I quote, "The violation of freedom to use international water and airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war."
Only 4 days after that speech from Kennedy, on October 26th, the USSR sent their first letter to the US saying that they would remove the missiles from Cuba as long as the US didn't invade the island. The next day, several things happened. First, an American plane was shot down over Cuba, and as a result, US invasion forces were readied in Florida. The pilot who died, Major Rudolph Anderson, is considered the only US combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That exact same day, a Soviet submarine was impacted by a US Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. Apparently, the only reason that Russians decided not to shoot nuclear torpedoes from the submarine was because one out of the 3 commanders decided he didn't have enough information to make the call. And this commander was Vasily Arkhipov.
Thank you, sir. And more importantly, even on that day, a second letter came from the USSR with more demands. This was only a day after the first one. And at this point, the Soviet Union said they would back down if the US removed their missiles from Turkey. So officially, Kennedy ignored the second letter from Khrushchev and responded to the first one. However, privately, Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrinin, and agreed that the US would remove their missiles from Turkey, but this could not be made public.
On October 28, the conflict ended. Khrushchev issued a public statement that Soviet missiles will be dismantled and removed from Cuba. On November 20, 1962, the United States ended its quarantine, and in April 1963, the US missiles were removed from Turkey. Khrushchev will eventually fall from power 2 years later, because many Soviets saw his act of retreating as a weakness for the Soviet Union.
During the summer of 1963, the US, the USSR, and the UK ended up signing the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which had been negotiated for 8 years but accelerated by the Cuban Missile Crisis. This prohibited nuclear weapon tests and other explosions underwater in the atmosphere and outer space, and the signatories pledged to work towards disarmament. Similarly, in 1968, so about 5 years later, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed at an international level at the United Nations. One of its main objectives was to stop countries from supplying nuclear technology to others, and it also further prohibited nuclear weapons tests. To date, it is the only binding commitment in a multilateral treaty with the goal of disarmament by nuclear weapon states.
Besides these nuclear treaties, other events happened after the conflict ended. A direct hotline was also set up between the White House and the Kremlin in August 1963. The objective was to enhance and favor better communications between the USSR and the United States. J.F. Kennedy died in November 22, 1963. He was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Some state that he was probably working for a local political group that didn't like Kennedy's politics, but others believe that he was an agent of the Soviet Union.
There are different narratives about the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK was often seen as a hero for stopping a nuclear conflict, but the truth may be more ambiguous. For example, one wrong move or communication error could have led to a nuclear war. It was also debated how much of a threat the Soviet Union's missiles in Cuba actually represented. In recordings from the ex-com meetings, Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, said, "I'll be quite frank, I don't think there is a military problem here. This is a domestic political problem." In fact, when McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor at the time, asked, "What is the strategic impact on the position of the US of these missiles in Cuba? How gravely does this change the strategic balance?" McNamara answered, "Not at all." So this whole conflict might have been as political as it was military.
So now you might be wondering what happened to Cuba. The collapse of communism in the early 1990s had a profound effect on Cuba. Soviet economic subsidies ended as of January 1st, 1991. Cuba was submerged in a major economic crisis as a result. Minor adjustments were introduced, prioritizing a more liberalized foreign investment laws. But overall, it still remained as a Marxist dictatorship.
In 1996, the US Congress passed the Helms-Burton Law, which introduced even tougher rules on US dealings with Cuba and sanctions against any third-party nations or corporations trying to trade with Cuba.
US relations with the island remained tense. Some American presidents like Carter and Obama had a more lenient approach to foreign relations, while others like Bush and Trump doubled down on sanctions. In May 2004, Cuba responded by cultivating closer relations with China and North Korea. Fidel Castro died in November 2006 after having transferred power to his brother, General Raúl Castro. He remained in power until 2018, when Miguel Díaz-Canel took over, keeping Cuba under a communist regime.
So, to sum up our brush up, Cuba was controlled by the Spanish until their formal independence in 1902 that they obtained with the help of the United States. Eventually, Batista, a US-backed dictator, was overthrown by revolutionaries, including Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, who himself took power in January 1959.
Cuba's relationship with the US deteriorated quickly when they turned their foreign relations towards the USSR. As a result, Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which was a failed attempt to overthrow Castro's regime.
The next year, in 1962, in response to the attempted invasion and the threat of American nuclear weapons in Turkey, the USSR placed nuclear weapons in Cuba. When the US found out, they put up a blockade around the island, and after negotiations, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles if the US agreed not to invade Cuba and remove their own missiles from Turkey. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost an important ally and investor. Today, relations remain tense between the US and communist Cuba.
That's all that we got for today.
We hope you've enjoyed this history brush-up. If you want to find out more about the wider Cold War context, go check out our episodes about the space race or the Korean War.
We started this podcast to make history more fun and accessible. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and giving us a positive rating.
We'll catch you in the next episode.
In the meantime, share your new knowledge with some friends, or even better, share this podcast with them.
We love the support.